Welcome to Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Freiburg. First things first, if you haven't already, please make sure to follow and subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. And just a quick note, it is also possible to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts for a small monthly fee. That really helps keep the show running and gives you access to extra episodes. The link for that is right down in the description.
Yeah, it's a great way to support the geopolitical analysis we do here.
Exactly. So for today's session, we've crafted something specifically for you, the listener who follows international relations, global security architectures, and, well, Danish politics closely. We are focusing our attention on the rapidly heating geopolitical landscape of the Arctic.
It's a region that is transforming faster than almost anywhere else on Earth, honestly. And that environmental transformation is it's completely rewriting the security protocols of the entire Northern Hemisphere.
Right. And our mission for this exploration is to understand how the melting ice is turning the high north from what used to be a quiet, relatively peaceful periphery into the absolute central stage for great power competition. We're going to examine the unique and frankly somewhat fragile constitutional position of the Kingdom of Denmark. We'll analyze the strategic maneuvering of the United States, the European Union, Russia, and China, and finally we'll assess what the future holds for the Arctic Council itself.
And to really ground this discussion, we are pulling from a pretty robust stack of recent intelligence and academic literature. We've got analysis from the European Foreign Affairs Review, some very detailed policy briefings from the Danish Institute for International Studies and the European Parliament, and a rather sobering strategic assessment from the Danish Defense Intelligence Service, their Outlook 2025 report.
Yeah, that report it's intense. But before we get into the details, just a necessary piece of housekeeping. These sources outline some heavily politically charged actions. We're talking military posturing and economic strategies from nations like the U.S., Russia, and China.
Right.
We want to be entirely clear that we are impartially reporting the facts and threat assessments exactly as they appear in the source material. We are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing any specific national viewpoints or policies. We're simply relaying the intelligence and academic reporting so you can fully understand the board as it stands today.
Absolutely. Our role is strictly analytical here. We're just helping you navigate the overlapping strategies of these global actors without any bias.
So let's just get right to it. I think we need to start with the fundamental structure of the Kingdom of Denmark, often abbreviated in policy circles as the Copenhagen. Anyone who follows Danish foreign policy knows that Copenhagen really only has a seat at the Arctic table because of Greenland.
Right. Geography dictates everything here.
It does. If you remove Greenland from the map, Denmark loses something like 98% of its total landmass. But what is truly interesting in these recent policy briefings is how aggressively Nuuk is leveraging that geographic reality. They are actively pulling diplomatic power away from Copenhagen.
And that internal tension is really the defining characteristic of the kingdom's current foreign policy. To understand how that leverage actually works, you have to look at the constitutional mechanics. Back in 2009, Greenland achieved self-government status. This was a massive structural realignment that gave Greenland authority over its internal affairs. So they managed their own education systems, their environmental regulations, and crucially,
the mineral resources.
Exactly, the rights to their subterranean mineral resources. However, the central government in Denmark still holds the constitutional authority over foreign policy, defense, and national security.
Which creates this immediate friction point.
Yeah.
Because in the modern Arctic, environmental policy and mineral rights are inextricably linked to foreign policy and national security. You can't separate them anymore.
No, you can't. And Greenland is highly aware of this intersection. If you look at their foreign policy strategy spanning 2024 to 2033, it is anchored by a very deliberate mantra. They say, nothing about us without us.
That is such a strong statement.
It is. They are demanding a primary voice in the geopolitical decisions affecting their territory. And that mantra is, at its core, a stepping stone toward the ultimate question for Greenland, which is full independence. A significant majority of Greenlanders support the transition to an independent, sovereign nation.
But looking at the structural economic realities detailed in the reports, there's a formidable hurdle to that independence. The economic data really grounds that ambition in some harsh reality.
It really does. Right now, Greenland operates with a heavy reliance on an annual block grant provided by the Danish government. To put a concrete number on it, in 2023, that grant amounted to 4.14 billion Danish kroner. Yeah, that single grant represents roughly 20% of Greenland's entire gross domestic product. Furthermore, their economic engine is remarkably singular. An overwhelming 97.8% of their export value is derived strictly from the fishing industry.
So you have a political trajectory aiming for sovereignty, but it's tied to an economy that currently lacks the diversification needed to replace a 20% GDP safety net.
Right.
Yet, even operating within those economic constraints, Greenland has become incredibly adept at flexing its diplomatic muscles within the kingdom. I mean, the recent appointment of Kenneth He is probably the most vivid example of this shifting power dynamic.
Oh, absolutely. That appointment was much more than a routine bureaucratic reshuffle. It was the culmination of a severe diplomatic standoff between Nuuk and Copenhagen.
For context, for those who might not have followed the specific diplomatic appointments, the Kingdom of Denmark operated without an official Arctic ambassador for a considerable period. In 2023, Copenhagen unilaterally appointed a Danish diplomat to fill the role, and Greenland immediately and publicly objected.
Their argument was straightforward and, frankly, hard to refute. The kingdom's entire status as an Arctic actor relies on Greenlandic territory. Therefore, a Greenlander should be the primary representative in Arctic forums.
And Copenhagen didn't just immediately concede, right?
No, they debated this for 2 whole years.
Yeah.
But ultimately, Copenhagen had to recognize that pushing Nuuk too hard on diplomatic representation could completely backfire. They cannot risk alienating Greenland, especially when external powers are constantly knocking on Nuuk's door. So in 2025, Kenneth He was officially appointed as the kingdom's Arctic ambassador.
And He is a highly experienced Greenlander. His appointment represents a historic transfer of diplomatic agency from Denmark to Greenland.
It's a huge shift.
But I want to push on that idea you just mentioned, of external powers knocking on Nuuk's door. Because this internal reshuffling of power is happening exactly as external pressures on the high north are multiplying. We are seeing a fierce acceleration in great power competition, driven primarily by the strategic triangle of the United States, Russia, and China. Let's look at the American posture first. The U.S. has maintained a critical footprint in Greenland for decades, anchored by the Thule space base.
Now known as Pacific.
Right, Pacific.
And Pacific is the absolute cornerstone of American homeland defense in the region. It houses early warning radar systems that are essential for tracking intercontinental ballistic missiles and monitoring space assets. It ties Greenland directly into the defense architecture of the North American continent.
Which makes the findings of the Danish Defense Intelligence Service's Outlook 2025 report so compelling. The DDIS explicitly warns Copenhagen that the United States, guided by its new national security strategy, is transitioning toward a hemispheric approach.
This is a crucial pivot. The intelligence assessment indicates the U.S. is consolidating its military focus and resources heavily toward its immediate region and, crucially, toward the Pacific theater to counter the strategic expansion of China.
But hold on, let's unpack that. If the primary U.S. objective is to counter China, and we know China is actively trying to establish a presence in the Arctic, why would the U.S. adopt a hemispheric approach that potentially reduces its forward engagement in the high north? Wouldn't they want to grip Greenland even tighter?
You would think so, but it comes down to a harsh reality of resource allocation and just the sheer vastness of the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. military, despite its size, cannot be everywhere at maximum capacity. Prioritizing the Pacific means making difficult calculations about force posture elsewhere. For Copenhagen, this intelligence generates profound anxiety.
I can imagine.
Because if American military attention is stretched across the Pacific, Danish officials are forced to question whether the United States will consistently remain Europe's primary security guarantor in the Arctic.
And yet, Washington is clearly aware of Greenland's inherent value. I mean, we all recall when U.S. President Donald Trump publicly floated the idea of purchasing Greenland, explicitly labeling it an absolute necessity for U.S. national security.
Yeah, while the diplomatic delivery of that concept was highly unconventional, it was a remarkably blunt assessment of Greenland's geopolitical worth. It stripped away all the diplomatic pleasantries and treated the territory purely as a vital strategic asset.
And Greenland's response was equally blunt. They firmly stated they were not for sale, adding that if forced into a binary choice regarding their alignment, they choose Denmark. But returning to the DDIS report, if the U.S. does proceed with this hemispheric approach and dials back its day-to-day Arctic engagement, what happens to the security environment?
Well, this is where we can apply regime theory. It analyzes how international cooperation frameworks, like those governing the Arctic, adapt, strain, or ultimately collapse under shifting power dynamics. If the dominant security guarantor, the U.S., creates a vacuum in the region, that vacuum invites immediate exploitation. And Russia remains the dominant military actor in the Arctic.
They really do.
They've spent the last decade systematically modernizing their northern fleet, heavily arming their icebreakers, and reopening Cold War-era military installations along their extensive northern coastline.
And China is not sitting idly by either. The sources note Beijing is aggressively pursuing what they term the Polar Silk Road. They want to capitalize on the melting ice to open faster shipping lanes to Europe. But it's not purely commercial, is it?
No, not at all. They are actively surveying under-ice submarine routes for their nuclear deterrent forces. They're seeking to mask their movements beneath the polar ice cap.
Which brings us to the core fear outlined by Danish intelligence. The DDIS assesses that if the U.S. steps back, it significantly emboldens Russian gray zone operations.
Yeah.
We've already seen the blueprint for this. Just look at the 2022 incident involving the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard.
Wow.
A critical undersea fiber optic communication cable connecting Svalbard to the mainland was mysteriously severed.
Exactly. And in gray zone warfare, the entire point is that attribution is nearly impossible to prove definitively. You have a severed cable, you might have Russian fishing trawlers acting erratically in the area, but proving a state-sponsored act of sabotage without triggering an outright military escalation is incredibly difficult.
Right.
It is high disruption, low accountability warfare, and Danish intelligence is warning that if the strategic deterrence provided by the U.S. falters, these hybrid operations targeting critical infrastructure, communication lines, and energy grids, they will likely multiply across the high north.
So if you're the Kingdom of Denmark, you are trying to manage an increasingly assertive Greenland internally while navigating a U.S.-Russia-China triangle externally. This leaves them highly dependent on their closest institutional alliances, namely NATO and the European Union. But both of these organizations are drastically expanding their Arctic footprints in completely different ways.
Very different ways.
Looking at NATO first, the strategic map has been entirely redrawn recently.
Yes. The accession of Sweden and Finland into the alliance represents a fundamental alteration of the northern security architecture. Prior to this, you had non-aligned buffer states. Today, every single Arctic nation, with the sole exception of Russia, is a member of NATO. The alliance has effectively constructed a unified northern wall.
Which seems like a major security win for Denmark, but it also creates a severe policy paradox. The stated diplomatic doctrine of the Kingdom of Denmark has long been to preserve the Arctic as a low-tension zone, prioritizing scientific cooperation over militarization.
And that doctrine is now colliding with reality. It is exceptionally difficult to maintain a low-tension environment when the military alliances of the surrounding states are fully consolidated in direct opposition to the one remaining state. Denmark is forced to balance its deep reliance on NATO's collective security umbrella against its desire to avoid provoking an arms race in its own backyard.
It's a tightrope walk.
It is. And Norway is performing the exact same high-wire act. They rely heavily on NATO coordination to counter the very tangible Russian military threat on the Kola Peninsula, while simultaneously trying to manage bilateral border relations without unnecessary escalation.
Now, if we pivot to the European Union, their strategy in the Arctic is fascinating because they are essentially operating from a position of exclusion. Legally and formally, the EU is locked out of Arctic governance. They are not a member of the Arctic Council.
No, they're not. For years, their attempts to secure formal observer status were blocked by Canada in retaliation for the EU's ban on the import of seal products.
And today, any movement on that observer status is being effectively vetoed by Russia. So, the EU finds itself without a formal seat in the boardroom where Arctic policy is debated. Yet they are executing an incredibly aggressive push to establish a permanent foothold, specifically in Greenland.
The motivation behind that push, according to the European Parliament briefings, is entirely focused on resource security. The European Union is in desperate need of rare earth elements, or REs.
Right, the critical minerals.
Exactly. These are the minerals required to manufacture modern technology, everything from smartphone components and wind turbine magnets to guidance systems for advanced weaponry. And Greenland sits on top of an estimated 12 million tons of these elements.
12 million tons.
Yes. To put that in perspective, that represents over 9% of the total known global resources. It is an astonishing concentration of strategic wealth and geopolitical leverage buried beneath the permafrost, and Brussels is acutely aware of its value.
So if you are the EU and you are blocked from the formal political councils, how do you secure access to those minerals? You deploy checkbook diplomacy. In March 2024, the EU officially opened a representative office in Greenland's capital, Nuuk, and they are backing this diplomatic presence with substantial capital. The reports highlight a €202.5 million financial package specifically earmarked to support Greenland's education sector.
Which is massive. When you consider that Greenland has a population of roughly 56,000 people, a €202.5 million investment is a staggering per capita infusion of capital. It is clearly designed to build foundational goodwill.
And it doesn't stop at education. The EU is heavily funding green growth initiatives, specifically focusing on power-to-X hydrogen projects. For those unfamiliar with the term, power-to-X essentially involves taking renewable energy like wind or hydropower, which Greenland has in abundance, and using it to create green hydrogen fuels.
The underlying strategy here is brilliant in its pragmatism. By financing power-to-X in education, the EU is positioning itself to turn Greenland into a literal powerhouse for European energy independence and critical mineral supply. They are cementing an indispensable economic partnership that entirely bypasses their lack of formal status in the Arctic Council.
Right, they don't need a seat at the council if they are the primary financier of Greenland's economic transition.
Exactly.
Speaking of the Arctic Council, we really need to examine the future of how this region is actually governed, because the Kingdom of Denmark is about to take the helm. In May 2025, the kingdom officially assumes the chairship of the Arctic Council from Norway for the 2025 to 2027 term.
And they are inheriting a diplomatic apparatus that is severely damaged. Norway's tenure from 2023 to 2025 was defined by paralysis. In the immediate aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, 7 of the 8 member states, the A7 as they are known, suspended all formal cooperation with Russia.
Which means the council effectively ceased to function in its traditional capacity. I mean, you cannot have comprehensive regional governance when the state that controls roughly half of the entire Arctic coastline is frozen out of the dialogue.
Precisely. The A7 eventually found mechanisms to resume work on certain projects that didn't involve Russian participation, but the broader mandate of the Council, especially regarding comprehensive climate data collection and maritime safety coordination, has been severely compromised.
Despite inheriting this fractured framework, the Kingdom of Denmark has published a highly ambitious agenda for their term. They have outlined 5 core priorities: Indigenous peoples, sustainable economic development, oceans, climate change, and biodiversity.
What makes this agenda historically significant is not necessarily the topics themselves, but the personnel driving them. Because of the diplomatic standoff we analyzed earlier, Greenlanders are now leading the charge for the entire kingdom.
Right. Kenneth Yu.
Yes. In his role as the new ambassador, he will chair the senior Arctic officials. That is the crucial body that directs the actual day-to-day operations and working groups of the Council. Furthermore, Vivian Matsfeldt, Greenland's Minister for Foreign Affairs, will chair the Council at the highest political level.
It is the absolute realization of their foreign policy doctrine. Greenland is no longer just the geographic reason Denmark is at the table. Greenland is sitting at the head of the table. But this presents a glaring analytical question. We have this indigenous-led, highly cooperative agenda focused on biodiversity and climate change. Can that framework actually survive in an environment defined by the rapid militarization, submarine deployments, and gray zone sabotage we just discussed?
That is the defining tension of Arctic governance today. Can soft power diplomacy regarding climate and indigenous rights function effectively when the hard power realities of US, Russia, China competition are actively militarizing the very same waters? Historically, the Arctic Council survived because member states agreed to leave military security issues outside the room. Today, the militarization is too pervasive to ignore.
So, connecting all of this intelligence and strategic maneuvering back to you, the listener, why does the fate of the High North matter to someone who might live thousands of miles away from the Arctic Circle?
It matters because the Arctic has transitioned from a remote, frozen frontier into the physical center of the global geopolitical chessboard. The rapid melting of the sea ice is opening new transpolar shipping routes that will fundamentally rewire the global supply chains you depend on, daily shifting maritime dominance and trade flows.
And the climate reality cannot be compartmentalized either. The Arctic is currently warming 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. The environmental feedback loops triggered there, melting permafrost releasing methane, the loss of reflective ice. They directly dictate weather patterns, agricultural yields, and sea level rise across the globe.
Furthermore, from a strict international security perspective, the concentration of American, Russian, and Chinese strategic assets in such close proximity creates a highly volatile flashpoint. An escalation in the Arctic, whether through a miscalculated gray zone operation or a direct naval confrontation, would not remain localized. It would trigger alliance commitments and instantly destabilize the global security architecture.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to consider long after this session ends. We have traced how Greenland is inching closer to potential sovereign independence. And it is highly likely they intend to fund that monumental transition by extracting the exact rare earth minerals the rest of the world desperately requires for the green energy revolution. But if they do achieve that independence, armed with a population of roughly 56,000 people and vast mineral wealth, will they truly be able to maintain their autonomy? Or will they simply trade their historical constitutional reliance on Denmark for a new, perhaps more demanding reliance on an economic superpower like the United States or China?
It is an incredibly delicate geopolitical balancing act, and the foundation they are standing on is quite literally shifting beneath their feet.
It truly is. Thank you for joining us for this extensive analysis of the Arctic's geopolitical future. If you found the insights in today's session valuable, please take a moment right now to explicitly follow the podcast on whichever app you are using.
And we highly encourage you to rate the show 5 stars. That rating is the single most effective way to help our analysis reach even more listeners who are as passionate about international relations and security policy as you are.
Until next time, keep a close watch on the High North.